France's history is a sweeping tapestry of medieval fiefdoms, revolutionary fervour, and imperial ambition that transformed a modest kingdom into one of the world's most far-reaching empires. Over the course of nearly a millennium, the French realm evolved from a loosely held collection of duchies and counties into a centralized monarchy, then into a republic, and finally into a global power whose influence was felt across 4 continents and countless cultures. This journey was driven by visionary rulers and restless revolutionaries, by philosophers and explorers, by merchants and military commanders, and by the tens of millions whose lives were forever altered in the process. At the heart of this saga lies a profound contradiction. France is the birthplace of the Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, yet it also built its wealth and prestige on colonial conquests, forced labor, and the subjugation of distant peoples. The same nation that stormed the Bastille to overthrow absolutism would soon dispatch armies to suppress uprisings in its own colonies. The same people who championed human rights would reinstitute slavery under Napoleon. Throughout its history, France wrestled with the tension between universal principles and the realpolitik of empire, a dynamic that shaped not only its own destiny, but the development of the modern world. Our story begins in the fumbling early Middle Ages, when power in Gaul was scattered among local lords, each backed by private armies of retainers and bound to a vague allegiance to distant kings or emperors. It was into this patchwork that Hugh Capet stepped in 987 CE, ascending the throne of a realm centered around Paris and laying the groundwork for the Capetian dynasty. Through carefully arranged marriages, judicious feudal grants, and strategic alliances with the church, the Capetians gradually extended their control over rival territories. By the 12th century, rulers such as Philip II Augustus had begun to consolidate key regions under direct royal authority, erecting royal officials in the provinces and fostering the emergence of a nascent national identity. Yet even as the crown's power grew, France remained an agrarian land of scattered villages, fortified hilltop castles, and local customs. Communication was slow, travel perilous, and loyalties often shifted with inheritance or the appeal of a stronger liege. It was the crucible of war, most notably the 100 Years' War against England, 1337–1453, that first welded diverse French populations into something resembling a unified nation. The protracted conflict devastated the countryside and tested the resilience of the realm, but it also kindled a sense of collective purpose. From the peasant levies who bore arms to the noble knights who pledged homage, a shared identity emerged, in resistance to a common foe. This wartime epoch produced iconic figures such as Joan of Arc, whose impassioned belief in divine guidance and fearless leadership at Orléans rallied the French cause. Though she was ultimately captured and executed, her martyrdom became a powerful symbol of French unity and spiritual solidarity. When the war ended with the expulsion of the English beyond Calais, France stood more cohesive than ever before, its borders largely defined, its monarchy strengthened, and its aspiration for greatness ignited. In the ensuing centuries, France turned its gaze beyond Europe's borders. Inspired by the riches brought to Spain and Portugal, French explorers such as Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain ventured into the Americas in the early 16th and 17th centuries. Navigating the St. Lawrence River and establishing trading posts, they laid the foundations of New France, a vast territory whose fur, timber, and fish would beckon merchants and settlers. Meanwhile, French ships began to ply the warmer waters of the Caribbean, seizing islands like Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, and transforming them into lucrative sugar coffee plantations. Back in Africa, the French established trading forts on the West African coast, engaging in commerce that would tragically include the human cargo of the transatlantic slave trade. By the mid-18th century, France's merchant fleet and naval power rivaled those of Britain and Spain. French culture, language, and law spread across continents, reaching indigenous societies in North America, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. Yet the expansion of civilization carried a heavy toll. Indigenous populations were displaced, traditional societies disrupted, and entire economies reconfigured around European demands. The plantation system in the Caribbean would become the epicenter of unimaginable cruelty, its profits underwriting French art, architecture, and courtly pageantry, even as voices at home began to question the morality of slavery and colonial domination. Back in metropolitan France, a ferment of intellectual and political change was underway. Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau championed reason, individual rights, and the social contract. Their writings inspired debates about monarchy, privilege, and the rights of man, debates that culminated in the convulsive events of 1789, when revolutionaries dismantled the Ancien Régime and declared the sovereignty of the people. The French Revolution unleashed both hope and terror. Its early years saw the abolition of feudal privileges and the proclamation of universal rights, while its later stages descended into the reign of terror and internecine bloodshed. Amid this turbulence, France's colonial possessions became a battleground of ideals. The revolutionary government abolished slavery in 1794, extending citizenship to free people of color in the colonies, only for Napoleon Bonaparte to reinstate bondage in 1802 as he sought to fund his imperial ambitions. Under Napoleon's rule, France conquered much of Europe and embarked on a bid for global supremacy, but ultimately met defeat in 1815 at Waterloo. Through each twist and turn, France's imperial project embodied the uneasy marriage of principles and power. It was an empire justified by mission civilisatrice, the supposed duty to civilize other peoples, yet pursued through violence, exploitation, and economic extraction. It was a republic that claimed to represent liberty, yet enforced inequality overseas. And it was a nation that exported revolutionary ideals, even as it clung to the regalia of emperors and kings. This series will guide you through that enthralling and complex history, from the medieval consolidation of Capetian kings to the rise and fall of global empires, from the philosophical heights of the Enlightenment to the grim realities of slavery and war. We will travel from the ramparts of Paris to the sugar fields of Saint-Domingue, from the banks of the Mississippi to the deserts of North Africa. Along the way, we'll explore how the dance between liberty and empire shaped France's identity and our own modern world. As you settle in for the night, let the soft cadence of history carry you across centuries, a story of ambition and contradiction, of soaring ideals and harsh realities, of a nation forever striving for glory even as it grappled with the cost of its conquests. This is the tale of liberty, glory, and empire, the story of France itself. The roots of power, medieval France and expansion. In the quiet dawn of medieval Europe, France was not yet the formidable nation that would one day project power across continents. Instead, it was a fractured land, a tapestry of duchies, counties, and feudal territories, each ruled by local lords who paid only nominal homage to a distant king. This decentralization left the throne weak, vulnerable to rival claimants and foreign incursions. Yet in 987 CE, a subtle shift began when Hugh Capet, a modest nobleman with a power base around Paris, was crowned king. His coronation marked the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, a line that would, over the next 3 centuries, transform France from a patchwork of warring fiefdoms into a centralized and enduring kingdom. The early Capetians ruled over little more than the Île-de-France region surrounding Paris, hemmed in by powerful feudal lords in Normandy, Burgundy, Aquitaine, and Brittany. Their authority often extended no further than where their knights could ride in a day. But unlike their predecessors, the Capetians practiced a shrewd policy of dynastic continuity. They crowned their heirs during their own lifetimes, ensuring an unbroken succession and avoiding the feudal chaos that often followed a monarch's death. They also cultivated alliances with the Church, which lent legitimacy to their claims and provided crucial moral authority in an age where divine favor justified rule. Gradually, through marriages, inheritances, and carefully chosen battles, the Capetians expanded their realm. Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, R. 1180–1223, was one of the dynasty's most successful builders of royal power. He waged war against the Plantagenet kings of England, reclaiming large swaths of French territory, including Normandy, Anjou, and Maine. Under Philip, the crown began to assert greater control over local lords, establishing royal courts, officials, and tax collectors in newly acquired lands. Paris grew in prominence as an administrative and cultural centre, its bustling markets and cathedral spires heralding the emergence of France as a cohesive kingdom. The consolidation of royal power continued under successors like Louis IX, Saint Louis, and Philip IV, the Fair, who pushed further reforms, strengthened royal justice, and codified administrative practices. By the early 14th century, the French monarchy stood as one of Europe's most formidable powers. Yet this ascent was soon tested by one of the longest and most destructive conflicts of the Middle Ages, the 100 Years' War. Beginning in 1337, this series of wars between France and England was rooted in disputes over succession, territorial claims, and the lingering legacy of feudal entanglements across the Channel. What began as dynastic quarrels soon became a crucible that would forge a deeper sense of French national identity. The war's early years were brutal for France. English armies, aided by superior tactics and the deadly longbow, won a string of crushing victories at Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356. The French countryside was ravaged by raids and mercenary bands. Famine stalked the land, and the Black Death compounded the nation's misery. Yet out of this suffering arose a growing sense of what it meant to be French. No longer merely subjects of feudal lords, peasants and nobles alike rallied to the crown as the symbol of collective survival. Nowhere was this more visible than in the figure of Joan of Arc. A teenage peasant girl from Lorraine, Joan claimed divine visions guiding her to support Charles VII's claim to the throne. Clad in armor and wielding a banner, she led French forces to lift the siege of Orléans in 1429, a pivotal moment that shifted momentum in France's favor. Though captured and executed by the English in 1431, Joan's martyrdom inspired renewed resistance and became a cornerstone of French patriotism for centuries to come. By 1453, when the war finally ended, the English held only the port of Calais. France, though scarred by decades of conflict, emerged more united and centralized than before. The war had drained the power of fractious nobles, elevated the prestige of the monarchy, and instilled in the French people a sense of shared destiny. The seeds sown in these medieval centuries, the consolidation of power under the Capetians and the crucible of the 100 Years' War, laid the foundation for the grand ambitions that would, in the coming centuries, propel France onto the world stage. Thus, in the ashes of feudal warfare, a new idea of France began to crystallize. Not merely a realm ruled by a king, but a nation bound by language, culture, and identity. It was an idea that would underpin France's future revolutions, fuel its colonial expansion, and echo across the centuries as the French Empire began to take shape. As France emerged from the trials of the Middle Ages and the 100 Years' War, its rulers began to turn their gaze outward across the oceans, toward lands whispered of by sailors and mapped only by rumor and imagination. The promise of wealth, territory, and prestige beckoned from the shores of the Americas, where Spain and Portugal had already begun to establish powerful empires. France, with its growing central authority and a newly emboldened monarchy, was eager to join the race for overseas dominion. Thus began France's earliest ventures into the New World, efforts that would eventually give rise to a sprawling yet fragile colony known as New France. The first notable step into this uncharted territory came in 1534, when King Francis commissioned Jacques Cartier, a skilled navigator from Saint-Malo, to find a northwest passage to Asia. Instead, Cartier sailed across the stormy Atlantic and explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Upon reaching the Gaspé Peninsula, he planted a wooden cross bearing the royal fleur-de-lis and claimed the territory for France. He then ventured further inland, navigating the river that would one day lend its name to one of North America's great cities, Montreal. Although Cartier encountered and traded with Iroquoian peoples and even brought a few back to France, his missions yielded no gold, spices, or passage to the Orient. Still, his voyages carved out a claim, a symbolic stake in a continent teeming with potential. For several decades after Cartier, France's presence in the Americas remained intermittent. Religious turmoil at home, including the wars of religion, between Catholics and Huguenots, and political instability kept colonial ambitions on hold. Yet the idea of a French America persisted, nurtured by explorers, traders, and missionaries who envisioned both spiritual conquest and material gain. In 1604, King Henry IV authorized a new attempt at colonization. The effort, led by Pierre Duguay de Mons and Samuel de Champlain, sought to establish a permanent French presence in North America. After a failed winter at St. Croix Island, they moved to the more hospitable shores of the Bay of Fundy, founding Port Royal in what is now Nova Scotia, the first successful French settlement in the New World. Though modest, it marked the beginning of a continuous French presence in North America. But it was Champlain who would emerge as the key architect of New France. In 1608, he founded a new settlement further up the St. Lawrence River, Quebec, perched atop a cliff with commanding views of the river below. Quebec quickly became the heart of French America. It served as a trading post, military fort, and administrative capital. From this small outpost, France would begin to weave a vast, though sparsely populated, colonial empire stretching from Newfoundland to the Great Lakes, and eventually down the Mississippi River to Louisiana. Trade was the lifeblood of New France, particularly in furs. French merchants, eager to profit from the European fashion for beaver hats, established extensive trading networks with indigenous nations. The fur trade, while lucrative, also tied the fate of New France closely to its indigenous allies, including the Huron, Algonquin, and Montagnais. Unlike their Spanish or English counterparts, the French often emphasized diplomacy and alliance over conquest, leading to a relatively more cooperative, though still deeply unequal, colonial dynamic. Missionaries, especially Jesuits, played a central role in this effort, living among indigenous communities, learning their languages, and seeking to convert them to Christianity. Their letters home, rich in ethnographic detail, helped shape France's image of the New World. Despite its grand geographic scope, New France struggled to attract large numbers of settlers. The harsh climate, distance from France, and lack of immediate wealth meant that the colony grew slowly. By the mid-17th century, its population numbered only a few thousand, a fragile thread stretched across a vast wilderness. The French crown attempted to incentivize immigration through land grants, military service, and the introduction of the filles du roi, young women sent from France to marry settlers and help populate the colony. Yet while New France never matched the demographic weight of British colonies to the south, it exerted a profound influence over the continent. French explorers like Étienne Brulé, Jean Nicolet, and later René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, pushed westward and southward, charting rivers, mapping lakes, and claiming vast inland territories. By the late 17th century, France claimed a corridor of land stretching from Quebec to the Gulf of Mexico, a vision of imperial reach that rivaled any in Europe. These early ventures laid the foundation for what would become a contested and often volatile empire in North America. The alliances formed, the rivers explored, and the trading posts established set the stage for centuries of competition with indigenous nations, with Britain, and with the very land itself. For France, The New World was both promise and peril, a place to extend its culture and influence, but also a terrain that tested its resolve and reshaped its destiny. Thus, in the quiet, snow-covered outposts of New France, one could already glimpse the outlines of a future empire, one driven by commerce and belief, strategy and survival, and the dream of French grandeur in a distant and unfamiliar world. The age of exploration, Canada, Caribbean, and Africa. In the dawning years of the 16th century, Europe's gaze turned ever more intently across the seas, driven by dreams of spices, gold, and new territories. France, emerging from centuries of dynastic conflict and forging a stronger centralized monarchy, was eager to secure its place among the rising maritime powers of Spain and Portugal. This desire for glory and wealth, combined with the curiosity sparked by the Renaissance, propelled French explorers toward the unknown, across the cold, treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, into the dense forests of North America, and toward the warm, sugar-rich islands of the Caribbean. It was in 1534 that Jacques Cartier, a skilled navigator from the rugged Breton coast, embarked on a voyage that would lay the cornerstone of France's North American ambitions. Commissioned by King Francis I, Cartier's mission was ostensibly to find a northwest passage to Asia, a coveted route that would bypass Spanish and Portuguese holdings and provide a direct line to the riches of the East. What he found instead was the mighty St. Lawrence River, a vast waterway that would become the spine of French colonial expansion in North America. Sailing into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Cartier explored the coastlines of Newfoundland and the Gaspé Peninsula. On July 24, 1534, he erected a wooden cross at Gaspé, claiming the land in the name of the French king. His encounters with indigenous peoples, notably the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, were marked by cautious trade and wary diplomacy. Though Cartier brought back tantalizing tales of fertile land and potentially rich resources, he failed to discover either gold or the elusive passage to Asia. Undeterred, Cartier returned twice more, venturing further upriver and reaching the site of present-day Montreal. There he wintered among the local peoples, whose help was crucial to surviving the brutal cold. Yet his reports of the new land, while hopeful, did not immediately spark a wave of colonization. France, torn by religious conflict and domestic rivalries, lacked the focus to sustain settlement efforts in these remote and forbidding territories. Nearly 7 decades later, in the early 17th century, France would make a renewed push into North America, driven by merchants eager for furs and kings determined to expand royal prestige. This time, leadership fell to Samuel de Champlain, a seasoned mariner and gifted diplomat whose patience and vision would earn him the title Father of New France. In 1608, Champlain founded a settlement on the banks of the St. Lawrence, choosing a strategic promontory beneath towering cliffs, a place the Algonquin called Quebec, meaning where the river narrows. Quebec was more than a fort. It was the first permanent French foothold in the vast North American wilderness, a bastion of commerce, faith, and royal ambition. Champlain recognized that the success of the colony would depend not on force alone, but on forging lasting alliances with indigenous nations. He built relationships with the Huron and Algonquin, joining them in war against the Iroquois Confederacy, a conflict that would define much of New France's early history. Champlain's small wooden palisade at Quebec soon became a centre of the fur trade. Canoes laden with beaver pelts arrived each year, connecting French traders to indigenous trappers deep in the interior. From these early exchanges grew a sprawling network of trade routes, missions, and outposts, stretching westward to the Great Lakes and south toward the Ohio Valley. Though precarious and constantly under threat from hunger, disease, and rival European powers, the settlement at Quebec endured. Champlain's vision was not merely economic, but cultural. He believed deeply in spreading Catholic faith and French customs across the continent. Jesuit missionaries arrived to learn local languages, convert indigenous communities, and record detailed observations of native societies, documents that remain vital records of early colonial encounters. These first decades of French exploration and settlement in North America laid the groundwork for an empire that would soon stretch from the icy Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico. It was a world of fragile outposts, risky voyages, and tentative alliances, but also one of extraordinary ambition and adaptability. French explorers learned from indigenous guides, adopted local technologies such as birch bark canoes, and depended on native agricultural knowledge to survive. In Canada, the seeds of New France took root slowly, nourished by the vision of men, like Cartier and Champlain, men who dreamed not only of profit but of planting French culture in the rich soil of a new world. From Quebec's rocky promontory, the story of French exploration would continue outward, weaving through rivers, forests, and native nations, each step carrying France further into the heart of a continent that was both promising and perilous. In the decades following the establishment of Quebec and the strengthening of France's foothold in North America, the gaze of French merchants, nobles, and the crown shifted southward toward the sun-drenched islands of the Caribbean and the rich coast of West Africa. Here, in the swirling currents of the Atlantic trade, lay the promise of unimaginable wealth, sugar, coffee, indigo, and the human lives that would be cruelly bound to their cultivation. The expansion into Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the rise of the French West Africa trade would become central pillars of France's global imperial project, entwining the nation's fortunes with the violence and profits of the Atlantic slave trade. By the early 17th century, European powers were vying for control of Caribbean islands that offered fertile volcanic soil and a climate ideal for tropical crops. The Spanish had claimed vast territories, but many smaller islands remained outside effective control. French buccaneers and privateers, often operating from bases in St. Kitts and Tortuga, began to seize footholds. By the 1630s, France formally established colonies in Martinique and Guadeloupe, displacing earlier Spanish claims and gradually building small settlements around fortified coastal towns. The early years of these colonies were harsh and uncertain. Settlers faced tropical diseases, hurricanes, resistance from indigenous Carib populations, and internecine rivalries. But by the mid-17th century, the colonies stabilized under royal governors who encouraged the cultivation of sugarcane, a crop that would transform not only the islands but the entire French economy. Sugar required intensive labor and large plantations. Planters initially attempted to use indentured European servants, but mortality rates were staggering and supply unreliable. Gradually, they turned to the transatlantic slave trade, importing enslaved Africans to toil in the brutal fields. It was in Saint-Domingue, the western portion of the island of Hispaniola, later known as Haiti, that the French colonial experiment in sugar reached its apex. By the early 18th century, Saint-Domingue had become the richest colony in the world, producing nearly half of the sugar and much of the coffee consumed in Europe. Enormous fortunes were made, underwriting opulent lives in Paris and funding France's palaces, art, and military adventures. But this wealth rested on staggering human suffering. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children were brought from West Africa, often chained in the dark holds of slave ships for weeks. In the Caribbean, they faced punishing labor, disease, and brutal punishments under the Code Noir, a legal framework that codified slavery and racial hierarchies. Meanwhile, on the African coast, French merchants established forts and trading posts in places like Senegal, Gorée Island, and along the Ivory and Gold coasts. These outposts served as hubs in a growing French slave trade where African middlemen and powerful kingdoms traded captives taken in regional wars or raids in exchange for European guns, cloth, beads, and other goods. French slaving companies and private traders grew wealthy from this trade, weaving a commercial network that linked Bordeaux, Nantes, and La Rochelle with West Africa and the Caribbean. The rise of the French West Africa trade was not solely about enslaved people. Merchants also traded in gum, gold, ivory, and later in palm oil, commodities that would continue to shape French-African relations into the 19th century. But slavery was the engine of this system, enriching port cities in France and fueling the plantations of the Caribbean colonies. In these centuries, the pattern of French colonial expansion was often pragmatic and ruthless, seizing opportunity where Spanish or English power was weak, exploiting local divisions, and building alliances with African and Caribbean leaders when it suited imperial aims. The promise of profit and the appetite of European markets for sugar, coffee, and exotic goods drove policy and justified conquest. Yet, from the beginning, resistance simmered. In the Caribbean, maroon communities of escaped slaves waged guerrilla war against colonial authorities. In Africa, some local rulers played European powers against one another to protect their own independence. The seeds of future upheaval and revolution were already sown amid the riches and cruelty of France's expanding empire. Thus, by the dawn of the 18th century, France had staked its claim in the Caribbean and West Africa, laying the groundwork for an imperial system that intertwined the fates of continents, generated immense wealth, and inflicted deep and lasting scars. This was the age where France's global empire began to take true shape, and where the contradictions between its professed ideals of civilization and the realities of conquest and enslavement grew ever more stark. Louis XIV. The Sun King's imperial vision. In the grand salons of Versailles, beneath gilded ceilings and mirrored halls, Louis XIV, the Sun King, presided over a France that believed itself the beating heart of European power. His reign, which stretched from 1643 to 1715, became synonymous with grandeur, absolutism, and an insatiable appetite for both territorial and cultural expansion. But Louis's vision of empire was not confined to the palace walls or European battlefields. It extended across the seas, carried by the sails of a burgeoning navy and the ambitions of merchants, generals, and colonizers determined to secure France's place as a global power. One of the defining features of Louis XIV's imperial vision was the systematic growth of France's navy and mercantile fleet. When Louis inherited the throne as a child, France's maritime power was relatively weak, overshadowed by the formidable fleets of England and the Netherlands. But under the guidance of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his brilliant finance minister, the Crown invested heavily in shipbuilding, naval arsenals, and coastal fortifications. New ports, such as Rochefort and Lorient, were constructed to support warships and commercial vessels. Colbert recognized that maritime strength was not merely about war, it was about trade. He encouraged the founding of powerful trading companies, including the French East India Company and the Compagnie des Indes Occidentales, which sought to challenge Dutch and English dominance in Asia and the Americas. Shipyards hummed with activity as hundreds of vessels were launched, carrying not just soldiers and cannons, but also silk, wine, arms, and other French goods to overseas markets. This naval expansion had profound consequences. It allowed France to compete more effectively in the Caribbean, where the sugar islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue became increasingly lucrative. French privateers, sanctioned pirates, preyed upon Spanish and English shipping, bringing back riches to royal coffers. The Atlantic seaways became the arteries of a growing colonial economy, linking France to the Caribbean, West Africa, and the fur-rich interior of North America. Yet Louis XIV's ambitions were never satisfied by trade alone. He envisioned France as the preeminent power of Europe, a realm whose borders would be secured and expanded through war. During his reign, France fought a series of conflicts: the Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and the War of the Spanish Succession, that reshaped the European map and drained the treasuries of every major power. These wars were driven by Louis's belief in dynastic right and the glory of France. In the Low Countries, Alsace, and along the Rhine, French armies seized towns and fortresses, often facing fierce coalitions of European rivals. These battles spilled into the colonies as well, where French and English forces clashed over control of North American fur territories, Caribbean sugar islands, and the sea lanes vital to transatlantic trade. The European wars of Louis's reign often intersected with colonial rivalries. During the 9 Years' War, French privateers attacked English and Dutch shipping in the Atlantic, while in North America, in a conflict known to English colonists as King William's War, French forces and their indigenous allies raided English settlements in New England and New York. In the Caribbean, Martinique and Guadeloupe became battlegrounds, their plantations burned and rebuilt in the shifting tides of imperial conflict. Meanwhile, the French presence in West Africa, anchored by trading forts like Gorée, grew more entrenched, feeding the insatiable demand for enslaved labor in the New World plantations. Louis's wars were costly, both in treasure and in blood. They strained France's finances and created deep resentments among the European powers. Yet domestically, Louis crafted an image of martial glory, presenting himself as a warrior king defending the realm and expanding its influence. He used art, architecture, and propaganda to cast his reign as a golden age, cementing Versailles as a symbol of absolute monarchy and French cultural supremacy. But beneath the pageantry, contradictions festered. While Louis projected strength, the cost of constant war and naval expansion left France burdened by debt. Colonial ventures brought wealth, but also sowed the seeds of future revolts, particularly as enslaved populations in the Caribbean outnumbered their masters, and indigenous nations in North America resisted French encroachment. Still, by the time of Louis XIV's death in 1715, France stood as a global power, with colonies spanning from Canada to the Caribbean, from Africa to India. The navy he built rivaled those of England and Holland, and the wars he waged left France both feared and admired. His imperial vision had set the stage for the next century of French ambition, where the pursuit of glory would continue to collide with the harsh realities of conquest, trade, and resistance across a growing, restless empire. When Louis XIV declared, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, he was not merely boasting, he was crystallizing the central idea of his reign and establishing a model that would define France's imperial and domestic character for generations. The transformation of the French monarchy into a system of absolute rule under Louis XIV had profound implications not just for France itself, but for the empire France sought to build overseas. Under Louis, the monarchy became the undisputed source of law, justice, and policy. The king reigned from the splendid court at Versailles, where he gathered the nobility, clergy, and ministers into a carefully choreographed display of power, loyalty, and dependence. Nobles who once wielded independent armies and ruled semi-autonomous provinces were drawn into Louis's orbit, their ambitions redirected into courtly rivalries and rituals rather than regional rebellion. This consolidation of power at home was critical. France had been torn by decades of religious wars and civil conflict in the 16th century, where nobles and provincial governors often acted as quasi-sovereign lords. Louis XIV and his advisors understood that to create a durable empire, one capable of projecting power across oceans and into the rival courts of Europe, the monarchy itself had to be unchallenged, stable, and singular. The bureaucracy Louis so built became a powerful engine for imperial ambition. Colbert, as Louis's finance minister, overhauled the tax system, centralized revenue collection, and invested in infrastructure that supported trade, military supply lines, and the development of colonial outposts. Provincial governors, naval commanders, and colonial administrators were all appointed by the king or his ministers, tying the fate of France's overseas territories directly to the authority of the crown. Louis's absolute monarchy also relied heavily on a narrative of divine right, the belief that the king ruled by God's will, ordained to bring order and civilization both to his own realm and to the wider world. This doctrine was extended to the colonies, where royal edicts and charters justified conquest and control over foreign lands and peoples. Missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, were dispatched across the empire to spread the Catholic faith, often working hand in hand with colonial officials to secure French influence and loyalty. In this framework, Louis positioned France as both the defender of Catholic Europe against Protestant rivals and as the bringer of civilization to indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans in the colonies. The Sun King's image was carefully cultivated in art, theatre, and architecture, casting him as the ultimate patriarch, a ruler whose brilliance illuminated every corner of the realm and empire alike. Versailles itself became the symbol of this new imperial order. It was not merely a palace, it was the administrative and ideological heart of a centralized state that believed itself destined to dominate Europe and rival empires. Courtiers jostled for favor in its gilded halls while ministers coordinated military campaigns stretching from the Rhineland to the Caribbean. This absolutist structure was mirrored in colonial governance. Governors-general in New France, intendant administrators in the Caribbean, and naval commanders on the African coast all operated under the guiding hand of Paris. Colonial assemblies, where they existed, had limited power, and ultimate authority rested with the king's representatives. Even in the distant outposts of Canada or Saint-Domingue, royal decrees were treated as the voice of the Sun King himself. The fusion of absolutism and empire created both strength and vulnerability. It allowed France to mobilize vast resources, build one of Europe's largest armies, and challenge England and the Dutch Republic on sea and land. But it also created a brittle system that depended heavily on the competence and authority of the monarch. Beneath the gleaming facade of Louis's rule, debts mounted, resentments festered, and colonial populations, from indigenous allies in North America to enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, bore the weight of a system designed above all to serve royal ambition. Still, the model Louis established became the template for French imperial rule in the 18th century, centralized, hierarchical, and justified by divine sanction and cultural mission. It was an imperial monarchy that saw no distinction between the king's authority at home and the assertion of French dominance abroad. In the brilliance of Versailles and the shadow of its grand halls, the future course of French colonial expansion was set, one defined by the union of absolute monarchy and the relentless pursuit of glory on the global stage. Canada and Louisiana, France in North America. In the 17th and 18th centuries, France's ambitions in North America took on a unique shape, weaving together commercial enterprise, religious mission, and territorial expansion into a tapestry that stretched from the icy waters of the St. Lawrence River to the warm, humid banks of the Mississippi. Central to this endeavor was the fur trade, a network of relationships and exchanges that connected French settlers with dozens of indigenous nations across the vast forests, rivers and lakes of the continent's interior. Unlike the plantation economies of the Caribbean, the French colonial system in Canada, known as New France, depended on forging alliances rather than imposing sheer domination. The fur trade, particularly in beaver pelts prized by European markets, required mobility, negotiation, and the cooperation of native communities who knew the land intimately. French traders, or coureurs de bois, ventured deep into the interior. establishing trading posts and often living among indigenous nations, adopting their languages, customs, and even marrying into their communities. These alliances were not just transactional. They became the backbone of French strategy in the face of constant pressure from British colonial rivals and hostile indigenous confederacies, such as the powerful Haudenosaunee Iroquois. The French often aligned with the Huron, Algonquin, and later the Illinois and other peoples, forging military and trading partnerships that bolstered French claims to the interior and provided critical support in conflicts like the Beaver Wars and later colonial wars against the British. Catholic missionaries, especially Jesuits, traveled alongside traders and soldiers, setting up missions and seeking to convert indigenous nations. Their letters and reports, sent back to France and widely read by an eager public, painted a complex portrait of life in the wilderness, both the promise of spreading Christianity and the daily hardships of colonial life. While Canada formed the northern axis of French expansion, another critical frontier lay to the south, where French explorers followed the Mississippi River system deep into the continent. In the late 17th century, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, journeyed down the Mississippi to its mouth, claiming the entire watershed for France and naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. This claim was not merely symbolic. Over the next decades, France established a network of forts, missions, and small settlements along the Mississippi and its tributaries, intended both to secure trade routes and to block British and Spanish expansion from the east and west. The founding of New Orleans in 1718 by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne, Sieur de Bienville, was a pivotal moment in this southern strategy. Perched on a bend of the river near the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans became a critical port, military outpost, and administrative center for France's Gulf Coast ambitions. Like Canada, Louisiana was shaped by the fur trade and by alliances with indigenous nations. But it also developed a plantation economy focused on indigo, rice, and later sugar. Enslaved Africans were brought to work these plantations, and the colony's population quickly became a mosaic of French settlers, native peoples, free people of color, and the enslaved. The Mississippi Valley settlements, including Natchez and Mobile, were often fragile outposts amid powerful native nations whose own rivalries and shifting alliances profoundly influenced colonial survival. French authorities negotiated treaties, traded goods, and sometimes waged brutal campaigns to maintain their foothold, but they never achieved the sheer settler numbers or agricultural base of the British colonies to the east. Yet, despite its demographic weaknesses, the French presence in North America represented a vast territorial claim. A crescent stretching from Quebec through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, and into the Gulf. This empire of rivers connected Canada and Louisiana into a single arc, controlling critical waterways and trade routes that shaped the balance of power on the continent. Throughout this period, the French approach in North America was marked by adaptability and pragmatism. Instead of displacing native nations wholesale, as the British often did, they sought coexistence, though not equality, working through alliances and kinship networks to secure trade and military strength. This approach would give France enduring influence in the interior even as rival empires encroached from the Atlantic coast and Spanish outposts dotted the western plains. In Canada and Louisiana alike, French ambitions flowed along the rivers, carried by canoes and bateaux, guided by the maps and knowledge of indigenous partners, and sustained by a vision of empire that prized alliance as much as conquest. These fur trade networks, fragile forts, and riverside settlements laid the foundations of a North American empire that, while eventually overshadowed by the British, left a profound cultural and historical imprint that continues to echo through the region's languages, laws, and memories. From the earliest days of France's expansion into North America, the French colonies faced the constant pressure of European competition. The British and Spanish, each building their own empires across the Atlantic, regarded France not only as a trading competitor, but as a dangerous imperial rival whose territorial ambitions threatened their own claims. These conflicts, which would ebb and flow over the course of a century and a half, shaped the very fabric of New France and Louisiana, testing the strength of French alliances with indigenous peoples and the resilience of their outposts in the face of invasion, siege, and shifting diplomacy. In Canada, conflict with the British was nearly inevitable. As English colonies expanded along the Atlantic seaboard, pushing inland through the Hudson and Mohawk valleys, they collided with the French fur trade networks that reached deep into the Great Lakes region. The Iroquois Confederacy, powerful and fiercely independent, often found itself courted by both empires, with its warriors sometimes serving as crucial allies in the proxy wars between France and England. One of the first major conflicts was the series of wars known collectively as the French and Iroquois Wars, or the Beaver Wars, in the 17th century. Here, French forces and their Algonquin and Huron allies clashed repeatedly with Iroquois warriors who were supplied with firearms by the Dutch and later the English. These brutal encounters were marked by raids on settlements, ambushes in the old forests, and a struggle for control over the fur-rich lands of the Great Lakes Basin. As the 18th century dawned, the competition became part of broader European struggles. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701–1714, known in the colonies as Queen Anne's War, saw French and British forces in North America engage in campaigns from New England to the Gulf Coast. In Acadia, modern-day Nova Scotia, French and British settlers exchanged control of forts and villages, while indigenous allies of both sides were drawn into raids and counter-raids. In the Mississippi Valley and the Gulf Coast, France's ambitions in Louisiana also sparked tension with Spain, whose colonial reach extended from Mexico into Florida and westward toward Texas. Spanish authorities viewed the French settlements at Biloxi, Mobile, and especially New Orleans with deep suspicion, fearing that they threatened the fragile chain of Spanish missions and presidios stretching across the Gulf. Skirmishes, competing treaties with indigenous nations, and naval confrontations became recurring features of life in the southern borderlands. The most significant of these rivalries erupted into the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, called the French and Indian War in the North American theater. Here, French forces in Canada and Louisiana, supported by long-standing indigenous allies, faced the full might of British colonial forces and regular troops from Britain itself. Early French successes, including the famous defeat of General Braddock's expedition in 1755, could not halt the tide of British manpower and resources. The British captured key French forts, such as Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, which guarded the gateway to the St. Lawrence River, and advanced toward the heart of New France. The pivotal moment came with the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, outside Quebec City, where British forces under General Wolfe defeated the French under Montcalm. Quebec fell, and with it, the hope of maintaining a permanent French presence along the St. Lawrence. By 1763, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war and reshaped the map of North America. France ceded Canada and its territories east of the Mississippi to Britain, while transferring Louisiana west of the river to Spain as compensation for Spain's own losses. The French imperial dream in North America, once envisioned as a vast arc from the icy north to the Gulf, had effectively collapsed. Yet even in defeat, France left enduring legacies. Many indigenous nations that had allied with the French continued to resist British encroachment, sparking uprisings such as Pontiac's War. French-speaking communities remained along the Mississippi, in Quebec, and in Acadia, where they would eventually forge new identities in places like Louisiana and Canada's eastern provinces. In the Caribbean and Gulf, the Spanish rivalry continued alongside British competition, as France sought to maintain its profitable sugar colonies and defend its remaining ports. Naval battles, privateering, and shifting alliances in Europe ensured that even after the loss of Canada, the French struggle against their imperial rivals was far from over. Thus, the conflicts with Britain and Spain were not merely battles for land, but for trade routes, alliances, and the very definition of empire in the New World. They tested the limits of French diplomacy and military strength, and though ultimately they constrained France's reach in North America, they also helped forge a resilient French identity that would survive in language, law, and culture long after the imperial banners had fallen. Slavery and sugar, the Caribbean colonies. In the shimmering turquoise waters of the Caribbean, France built what would become the economic engine of its global empire. The islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and above all Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, emerged as jewels in the crown of French colonial ambition. These colonies were not founded merely for territorial claims. They were designed to produce wealth, and at their heart lay sugar. The crop that turned raw land into plantations, plantations into fortunes, and human beings into commodities. By the 18th century, the French Caribbean had become one of the world's most lucrative centers of trade and agriculture. Saint-Domingue, seized from the Spanish in the western third of Hispaniola, quickly surpassed its neighbors to become the richest colony in the world. By the 1780s, it produced nearly half of all sugar consumed in Europe, along with massive exports of coffee, indigo, and cotton. The wealth from these colonies poured into French port cities such as Nantes, Bordeaux, and La Rochelle, funding mansions, shipyards, and the grand salons of Paris. But this prosperity rested entirely on the brutal institution of slavery. To satisfy the insatiable European demand for sugar, planters in Saint-Domingue imported hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. Torn from their homes, marched to coastal forts, and packed into the dark, fetid holds of slave ships, these men, women, and children endured a journey of horror across the Middle Passage. Mortality rates on the voyage were staggering. Even more deadly were the early years of forced labor on the plantations, where tropical diseases, punishing work schedules, and vicious punishments led to constant death and replacement. The plantation system in the French Caribbean was ruthless by design. Under the Code Noir, a set of laws regulating slavery enacted in 1685, enslaved people were considered property. Masters were granted nearly total authority over their lives, including the power to punish, sell, or kill. Plantations were often run like military camps, with overseers enforcing strict discipline and harsh quotas. The average life expectancy of an enslaved African in Saint-Domingue was shockingly low. Some historians estimate that the entire labor force turned over roughly every 2 decades, with new captives continuously arriving to replace the dead. Yet amid this violence, a rich cultural exchange emerged. Enslaved Africans brought languages, religious traditions, music, and culinary knowledge that blended with European and indigenous influences, creating distinct Caribbean cultures that endure today. Vodou, an African-derived spiritual practice, flourished in secret gatherings alongside Catholic rituals imposed by colonial authorities. In markets and in the quarters reserved for the enslaved, songs and drumming carried coded messages, preserving stories of Africa and dreaming of freedom. The free population of the colonies was equally complex. Alongside white planters, many of whom lived in France and managed estates through agents, there was a growing class of free people of color, often of mixed African and European ancestry. Some were wealthy, owning land, and even enslaved laborers of their own, while others struggled in the margins of colonial society, constrained by harsh racial codes that sought to maintain white supremacy. The enormous profits from sugar and slavery also fueled fierce rivalries. France and Britain, in particular, clashed repeatedly in the Caribbean, with islands changing hands during wars in Europe. Forts, naval patrols, and pirate raids became part of life in this volatile archipelago, where the struggle for sugar wealth drove empires into repeated conflict. For France, the Caribbean colonies were both triumph and tragedy, a source of national pride and enormous revenue, but also the site of unspeakable human suffering. This contradiction, the glittering wealth built atop chains and blood, would haunt the French conscience and become central to the revolutionary debates of the late 18th century. Voices in Paris would increasingly question whether a nation of liberty and equality could continue to profit from human bondage. Yet for most of the colonial era, profit silenced conscience. Ships continued to cross the Atlantic, carrying guns, cloth, and trinkets to Africa, and returning with human cargo bound for the cane fields of Saint-Domingue. Planters grew rich, the metropole thrived, and beneath the whip, the enslaved waited, resisted, and dreamed, sowing the seeds of a revolution that would one day shake the entire Atlantic world. The First Empire, Revolution, Napoleon, and Global War. In 1789, a storm erupted in France that would send shockwaves across the globe. the French Revolution. Born from the simmering tensions of inequality, debt, and Enlightenment ideals, the revolution was at first a struggle to establish liberty, equality, and fraternity within the metropole. But from the outset, its ideals posed profound questions about the nature of the French Empire, particularly in its colonies, where the wealth of the nation was built upon the labor of enslaved Africans. As revolutionary fervor gripped Paris, debates erupted over the rights of free people of color and the morality of slavery. In the National Assembly, abolitionist voices, inspired by Enlightenment thinkers and by petitions from the colonies, demanded an end to racial discrimination and eventually slavery itself. The free people of color in Saint-Domingue, many of whom were wealthy and educated, lobbied fiercely for equal rights with whites, sparking unrest in the colony as planters resisted any dilution of their power. Meanwhile, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue and other colonies watched and listened. Rumors of freedom swept through the plantations. Secret gatherings and coded messages hinted that the revolutionary promises of equality might finally extend to the Caribbean's suffering millions. In 1791, the largest slave uprising in history began in Saint-Domingue, as thousands of enslaved men and women rose up against their masters, burning plantations and seizing weapons. The insurrection transformed Saint-Domingue into a battleground where French planters, revolutionary commissioners, royalist conspirators, Spanish forces from neighboring Santo Domingo, and eventually British troops all vied for control. Amid this chaos, revolutionary France, desperate to retain its wealthiest colony and needing the support of black rebels against foreign invaders, took a radical step. In 1794, the French National Convention officially abolished slavery throughout the French colonies, proclaiming freedom and citizenship for all. This decree was both a moral milestone and a pragmatic move. It brought thousands of black and mixed race fighters into the revolutionary camp, helping drive out British forces and secure French authority in the Caribbean. Figures like Toussaint Louverture, an extraordinary leader and former enslaved man, emerged as critical allies to France, pledging loyalty to the Republic in exchange for freedom and political power. Yet the abolition of slavery under the revolutionary government was never universally embraced. Planters and merchants in France decried the loss of profits from sugar and coffee. Counter-revolutionaries used it as evidence of revolutionary excess and madness. And across the colonies, freedom remained fragile, often dependent on local power, struggles, and the shifting priorities of Paris. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power at the turn of the 19th century, promising order, glory, and renewed French greatness, he viewed the colonies not through the lens of revolutionary idealism, but as economic assets vital to his imperial ambitions. In 1802, with the Haitian Revolution still raging and Louverture consolidating power in Saint-Domingue, Napoleon sent a massive expedition to the island. His aim was clear: restore French control, reimpose plantation discipline, and ultimately reinstate slavery as the engine of colonial wealth. Napoleon's forces captured Louverture through deceit and shipped him to France, where he died in prison. But the attempt to re-enslave the colony sparked fierce resistance. Under new leaders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the black armies of Saint-Domingue waged a brutal and successful war against the French, defeating them decisively by 1804. In that year, the colony declared independence as Haiti, the first Black Republic and the first nation born of a successful slave revolt. Napoleon did re-establish slavery in other French Caribbean colonies, including Guadeloupe and Martinique. In 1802, a decree officially revoked the abolition laws, reimposing the brutal plantation regime. In these islands, thousands of formerly free people were forced back into chains, sparking violent revolts that were often crushed with savage reprisals. This contradiction, the promise of liberty in Europe and the brutal restoration of slavery in the colonies, haunted Napoleon's regime. Even as he crowned himself emperor in 1804 and marched across Europe seeking conquest and glory, the moral stain of colonial slavery remained. The wars of the First Empire, global in scale, were thus not merely battles of European armies, but struggles fought on Caribbean soil and in the holds of slave ships, where human freedom and imperial ambition collided. The restoration of slavery under Napoleon did not erase the revolutionary promise entirely. It fanned the flames of resistance, strengthened abolitionist movements, and foreshadowed the long, bloody conflicts that would eventually bring colonial slavery to an end in the 9th century. In this era, the fate of France's empire was bound inseparably to debates over freedom, race, and human dignity, debates that would echo far beyond Napoleon's fall. With the restoration of slavery in the colonies and the brutal campaigns in the Caribbean underway, Napoleon Bonaparte turned his attention to Europe and beyond, setting into motion a series of wars that would reshape the continent and redefine the reach of French imperial power. Known collectively as the Napoleonic Wars, these conflicts from 1803 to 1815 were more than battles for territory. They were an attempt to build an enduring French-dominated order that stretched across Europe and, in Napoleon's imagination, reached into the ancient lands of the East. One of Napoleon's earliest and most dramatic moves came even before his coronation as emperor, his campaign in Egypt in 1798. Officially justified as a move to protect French trade interests and weaken Britain's access to India, the Egyptian expedition was also wrapped in Enlightenment-era dreams of science and discovery. Napoleon brought with him not just an army, but scholars, engineers, and artists, hoping to establish a new French presence on the edge of Asia while studying the ruins of pharaohs. The military campaign was initially successful, with French forces capturing Alexandria and defeating the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids. Yet the British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, shattered the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, cutting Napoleon off from France. The expedition ultimately bogged down amid local resistance, disease, and British pressure, though it left a profound legacy, sparking European fascination with Egyptology and producing the monumental Description de l'Égypte, a compendium of maps, drawings, and studies of Egyptian antiquities. Back in Europe, Napoleon's ambitions knew few bounds. After seizing power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799 and declaring himself first consul, he built one of the largest and most disciplined armies the world had ever seen. French forces swept through Italy, Austria, and parts of Prussia, reorganizing German states under French influence and crowning Napoleon's brothers and allies as kings and dukes. The Napoleonic Empire at its height stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of Russia in the east, from the Baltic in the north to Naples and the Adriatic in the south. It was an empire built not through negotiation and diplomacy, but through conquest, battle, and the redrawing of borders by imperial decree. Under French rule, civil codes, administrative reforms, and modern taxation systems were imposed, often by force, while resistance movements and popular uprisings simmered in conquered territories. Britain remained Napoleon's most steadfast enemy, funding coalitions against him and dominating the seas with its navy. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to blockade Britain and deny it trade with Europe, strained relationships with neutral powers and stoked resentment among European merchants. Meanwhile, in Spain and Portugal, a guerrilla war sapped French strength, while Austria and Russia regrouped and launched fresh offensives. Napoleon's fatal mistake came in 1812, when he launched an invasion of Russia with the largest army he had ever assembled. The campaign, meant to force Tsar Alexander I into submission, instead became a nightmare. Russian forces retreated, burning towns and supply lines. When Napoleon's Grand Armée reached Moscow, the city was in flames. Cut off from supplies, and facing the harsh Russian winter, the French army collapsed in retreat, suffering catastrophic losses. This disaster emboldened Napoleon's enemies. Prussia, Austria, and Britain joined Russia in a new coalition. One by one, the states of Europe turned against Napoleon. In 1814, after a string of defeats, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba. He would briefly return in 1815 for the 100 Days, a final bid to reclaim power, but was decisively defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in June of that year. Captured by the British, he was sent into permanent exile on the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. With Napoleon's fall, the First French Empire collapsed. The monarchy was restored in France, and the Congress of Vienna sought to rebuild Europe's balance of power, erasing or rewriting many of the borders and reforms Napoleon had imposed. Yet the Napoleonic era left deep scars and lasting legacies. The spread of revolutionary legal codes, the rise of nationalism across Europe, and the memory of an empire that, for a brief and tumultuous period, sought to unify a continent under French rule. Haitian Revolution and the Loss of the Jewel. In 1791, as the fires of revolution consumed Paris and debates over liberty and equality echoed through the halls of the National Assembly, a different kind of revolution ignited thousands of miles away in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Known as the jewel of France's colonial empire, Saint-Domingue was the most profitable colony in the world, producing vast quantities of sugar, coffee, and other goods on the backs of enslaved Africans. But in the shadows of the plantation system, beneath the lash and chains, the seeds of freedom had long been growing, nurtured by whispered hopes, African spiritual traditions, and the example of revolutionary France itself. The uprising began on the night of August 22nd, 1791, as enslaved people across the northern plains of the colony rose up in coordinated rebellion, burning plantations and killing overseers. What began as a violent revolt against the system of bondage quickly evolved into a revolutionary movement demanding full emancipation and self-determination. At the heart of this movement stood Toussaint Louverture, a former slave who had gained his freedom and become a skilled military commander, diplomat, and visionary leader. Toussaint proved to be both tactically brilliant and politically astute. He forged alliances with Spanish forces in Santo Domingo, when it served the interests of the rebels, and later switched allegiance to revolutionary France after the National Convention abolished slavery in 1794. He understood the shifting political landscape of Europe and used it to secure the greatest possible advantage for his people. Under his leadership, formerly enslaved soldiers, many armed and trained by rival European powers, pushed back the armies of Britain and Spain, defending the revolutionary gains of the black population in Saint-Domingue. By the late 1790s, Toussaint Louverture had become the de facto ruler of the colony. He reorganized its economy, rebuilt plantations under a system of paid labor, reopened trade with the United States and Britain, and promulgated a constitution in 1801 that named him governor for life. Though he nominally pledged allegiance to France, his constitution declared Saint-Domingue's autonomy in internal affairs, a clear step toward independence that alarmed Napoleon Bonaparte, then consolidating power in France. Napoleon, eager to restore French authority in the colonies and to reinstate the lucrative plantation economy, including slavery, dispatched a massive expeditionary force to Saint-Domingue in 1802 under the command of his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc. At first, Leclerc attempted to negotiate, promising security and peace. But soon, the French campaign descended into brutal warfare. Toussaint was eventually captured through deceit and sent to France, where he died in prison in 1803. Yet the resistance did not die with him. Under new leaders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, the Black Army of Saint-Domingue continued the fight, fueled by bitter knowledge of Napoleon's intention to restore slavery, as he had already done in Guadeloupe. The war turned increasingly savage, with massacres, scorched earth tactics, and racial vengeance on both sides. Finally, on January 1, 1804, the revolutionary leaders declared independence, renaming the colony Haiti, from the Taino word for its mountainous land. It was the first successful slave revolt in history, the first black republic in the modern world, and a staggering blow to European colonialism. Haiti's declaration ended France's rule over its richest colony, dealing a mortal wound to its imperial dreams in the Americas and inspiring enslaved and oppressed people across the Atlantic world. The loss of Saint-Domingue was more than just the collapse of an economic engine. It was a moral reckoning, a reminder that the very foundations of European wealth and power in the Caribbean rested on brutal exploitation, and that those subjected to this system would not suffer forever. In the salons of Paris and the markets of Nantes, the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves, challenging the very logic of empire and forcing the French elite to confront a reality they had long denied, that the enslaved were not property, but human beings capable of claiming their own freedom through blood and sacrifice. In the years that followed, Haiti would face isolation, punishing debt and continued struggles, but its revolution remained a beacon, a testament to the power of the human spirit to break chains and claim dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. For France, the loss of its Caribbean jewel marked the beginning of a new imperial era, one that would turn its gaze toward Africa and Asia, seeking fresh frontiers to replace what was lost in the fires of Haitian freedom. The loss of Saint-Domingue in 1804 sent shockwaves through France's imperial ambitions. For decades, the colony had been the linchpin of French overseas wealth, producing nearly half of the sugar and coffee consumed in Europe, and generating profits that enriched French merchants, shipbuilders, and the royal treasury alike. Its ports had fueled the economies of cities like Nantes and Bordeaux, while its plantation system stood as the cornerstone of France's global commercial network. Now, that engine of wealth was gone, ripped away by the determination of formerly enslaved men and women who had turned the tools of their oppression into instruments of freedom. The Haitian Revolution did not just destroy French power in the Caribbean, it fundamentally altered how France viewed empire itself. In Paris, policymakers, generals, and financiers were forced to grapple with a stark new reality. The old colonial system, built on racial slavery and brutal plantation labor, could not be maintained in the face of determined resistance. Napoleon, who had envisioned the Caribbean as a critical base for projecting French influence into the Americas, including plans to reassert French power in Louisiana, abandoned those ambitions. In 1803, anticipating the collapse of Saint-Domingue and needing funds to continue his European wars, he sold Louisiana to the United States in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. This enormous transfer of territory marked the end of France's grand North American dream, which had once stretched from the icy forests of Quebec to the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. This pivot away from the Caribbean and the Americas did not end French imperial ambition. Rather, it redirected it. Even before the final defeat of Napoleon, French strategists began to look east and south, to Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually Southeast Asia, seeking new opportunities to replace what had been lost. The economic lessons of Saint-Domingue loomed large in this shift. Many in France came to believe that empire could not rely solely on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean or the vast continental frontiers of North America. Instead, it required more diverse, controllable, and strategically defensible holdings. Thus, in the decades that followed, French imperial attention turned to the conquest and colonization of Algeria, beginning in 1830, and later to expansion into West and Central Africa. In the Indian Ocean, the islands of Réunion and Mauritius gained new significance as naval bases and trading posts. Meanwhile, in Asia, French merchants and missionaries pushed into Indochina, laying the groundwork for colonial rule in Vietnam and Cambodia by the mid-19th century. The loss of Saint-Domingue also cast a long ideological shadow. It served as a cautionary tale that haunted French colonial planners for generations. Memories of the Haitian Revolution, of plantations in flames, massacres of French settlers, and the humiliating defeat of imperial armies by black rebels fostered a deep anxiety about slave uprisings and resistance movements in other colonies. This fear fueled brutal crackdowns on dissent and tighter racial controls across the French colonial world. even as it prompted occasional debates in Paris about reform and gradual emancipation. At the same time, the Haitian Revolution inspired global abolitionist movements, energizing anti-slavery activists in Britain, the Americas, and even in France itself. Though France would not permanently abolish slavery until 1848, the example of Haiti and the impossible-to-ignore fact that it had forced France's hand into abolition, however temporarily, in 1794, remained a powerful reference point for those arguing that slavery was incompatible with the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality. Economically, the collapse of Saint-Domingue forced France to reimagine the sources of imperial profit. While the Caribbean had once dominated the imperial imagination, now West Africa's palm oil, Algeria's cereals and wine, and Indochina's rice and trade routes gained prominence. This diversification was both practical and ideological, part of a broader shift in which European empires began justifying conquest not simply through profit, but through so-called civilizing missions, casting themselves as bringers of modernity, science, and law to less developed lands. Thus, the loss of Saint-Domingue did not mark the end of French Empire, but rather its transformation. The dream of sugar-fueled dominion in the Caribbean gave way to a global strategy that sought new frontiers in Africa and Asia, reshaping the nature of imperial rule and the ways in which France projected power abroad. Yet behind every policy, paper, every colonial expedition, and every speech in the Chamber of Deputies lay the ghost of Saint-Domingue, a constant reminder that the people at the heart of empire would not remain forever silent, and that freedom, once kindled, could never be entirely extinguished. The Second Empire, Africa, Asia, and new ambitions. In the wake of the Haitian Revolution and the collapse of France's Caribbean ambitions, French imperial policy entered a new phase. Beginning in 1830, with the conquest of Algiers, France launched what historians often call the Second French Colonial Empire, a sprawling, ambitious project that would span Africa, Asia, and the Pacific over the next century. This shift was not merely opportunistic. It reflected a profound reimagining of France's global role and the nature of empire itself. The first and perhaps most dramatic act of this new era was the invasion of Algeria in 1830. Nominally justified as a response to the so-called fly whisk incident, in which the Dey of Algiers allegedly struck the French consul with a fly whisk, the conquest quickly evolved into a far more sweeping enterprise. French forces captured Algiers, dismantled the local Ottoman-backed regime, and began a slow, often brutal expansion into the Algerian interior. What began as a limited operation transformed into a decades-long campaign of pacification and settlement. French armies, faced with fierce resistance from Algerian tribes under leaders like Emir Abd al-Qadir, waged a scorched earth war, destroying villages, seizing lands, and using collective punishments to break resistance. Tens of thousands of Algerians died, while thousands more were displaced from their ancestral lands. Meanwhile, in Paris, the conquest of Algeria was framed as a civilizing mission, a chance to spread French culture, language, and supposedly superior systems of government and law. Colonial officials and intellectuals spoke of transforming Algeria into an extension of France itself, a land where French settlers or colons could build new lives and contribute to the nation's glory. Over time, hundreds of thousands of Europeans, mainly French but also Italians and Spaniards, migrated to Algeria, forming a powerful settler community that would dominate local politics and economy for more than a century. The conquest of Algeria became a template for French imperial expansion across North Africa. In the decades that followed, French armies pushed into Tunisia and Morocco, establishing protectorates and redrawing the map of the Maghreb. These campaigns were driven by both strategic considerations, controlling the Mediterranean's southern shores, and economic ambitions, as French investors sought access to land, minerals, and markets. At home, the conquest of Algeria and the expansion into North Africa helped bolster national pride, particularly during periods of political instability. France in the mid-19th century was racked by revolution and regime change, from the July monarchy to the Second Republic, to the rise of Napoleon III's Second Empire. In each case, colonial ventures offered politicians and emperors a chance to rally public opinion, project strength, and distract from domestic divisions. Under Napoleon III, who ruled as emperor from 1852 to 1870, the imperial project took on renewed urgency. Algeria was further integrated into the French state, with new administrative structures, expanded railways, and waves of settlers. Meanwhile, French attention turned eastward to the Mediterranean and beyond, laying the groundwork for later expansion into Indochina and West Africa. Yet even in this early period, the contradictions of empire were stark. While France proclaimed itself the champion of liberty and progress, its armies employed brutal tactics to crush resistance. Lands were confiscated from Algerians and redistributed to European settlers. Indigenous culture and languages were marginalized in favor of French schools and Catholic missions. Behind the rhetoric of civilization lay a reality of exploitation, violence, and deepening racial hierarchies. The conquest of Algeria also reshaped French identity itself. For the first time, France administered large territories on the African continent, confronting questions of race, citizenship, and belonging that would haunt it for generations. Debates erupted over whether Algerian Muslims could ever be truly French, whether colonial subjects should have representation in Paris, and how far French law should extend into colonized lands. Algeria became, in effect, a testing ground for the larger French imperial project, an experiment in settler colonialism, assimilationist ideology, and military conquest that would echo across the empire in the decades to come. By 1870, as the Second Empire collapsed in Europe after defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the seeds had been sown for France's expansion deeper into Africa and Asia, fueled by a belief that empire was not just an opportunity, but a necessity for national greatness. In this way, the conquest of Algeria and the birth of the Second French colonial empire set the stage for a new era of French ambition. An era defined not by sugar and Caribbean plantations, but by land, resources, and the dream of France as a global power stretching from the Sahara to the Mekong. As French ambitions in North Africa cemented into territorial control and settler dominance, eyes turned further afield, to Asia and, deeper, into the African continent. The Second French colonial empire was never content with holding just Algeria or Tunisia. Its architects envisioned an empire that would rival Britain's, spanning continents and showcasing French civilization and modernity. In Southeast Asia, these ambitions culminated in the establishment of French Indochina, while in West Africa, explorers, soldiers, and administrators pushed inland, carving out vast territories in the name of the tricolour flag. French involvement in Indochina began in earnest in the mid-19th century, motivated by a mixture of commercial ambition, missionary zeal, and imperial rivalry with Britain. French forces intervened in Vietnam under the pretext of protecting Catholic missionaries and trade interests. In 1858, France launched a military expedition against the Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam. Over the following decades, French power expanded step by step, from controlling the southern region of Cochinchina to imposing protectorates over Annam and Tonkin in the north. By the 1880s, France had also extended its reach into neighboring Cambodia and, later, Laos, effectively transforming much of mainland Southeast Asia into the federation known as French Indochina. In these new territories, the French colonial administration built ports, railways, and roads aimed at extracting raw materials, especially rice, rubber, and minerals, to fuel industries back in France. Missionaries established schools and churches, eager to spread Christianity and French culture. Yet, as in Algeria, the rhetoric of civilization masked the harsh realities of colonial exploitation. Vietnamese farmers were pushed off fertile lands in favor of large French plantations. Taxes increased, local rulers were sidelined or co-opted, and any resistance was swiftly put down by French troops. The colony also brought about complex cultural interactions. A new Vietnamese elite emerged, educated in French schools and fluent in the language of the colonizer, yet caught between collaboration and nationalism. Over time, seeds of anti-colonial sentiment began to sprout here too, a movement that would eventually, in the 20th century, become a flood tide against French rule. While France was expanding in Indochina, it was also staking claims in West Africa. Driven by trade interests, geopolitical rivalry, and the ideology of the so-called civilizing mission, French explorers mapped the Niger River and the Sahara's southern rim. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, a fierce contest among European powers, accelerated French expansion. Treaties, often signed under duress or by local leaders who had little understanding of European imperial intent, laid the legal groundwork for conquest. French armies, led by officers like Louis Faidherbe and later Joseph Gallieni, pushed through. Resistance from powerful African states such as the Tukulor Empire and Dahomey. By the dawn of the 20th century, French West Africa was an immense domain stretching from Senegal in the west to modern Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Côte d'Ivoire, and beyond. These territories were grouped under administrative federations, meant to centralize control and maximize resource extraction. The French also extended their presence into Central Africa, building an empire that included Gabon, Chad, and parts of modern Congo. Just as in Indochina, the French claimed they were bringing progress: schools, roads, railways, and medical services. But the heart of the project lay in exploiting labor and natural wealth. Forced labor policies, brutal taxation regimes, and suppression of resistance defined the daily experience of millions of Africans under French rule. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the expansion of empire transformed the capital into the beating heart of a global project. Colonial exhibitions displayed African and Asian cultures as curiosities, reinforcing notions of European superiority. Politicians debated imperial policy in the National Assembly, while merchants, industrialists, and financiers profited from colonial goods, palm oil, rubber, timber, and rice that flowed into French ports. By the turn of the 20th century, Paris was the center of a sprawling web of colonies. Streets were named after colonial conquests. Military parades celebrated distant victories. Museums and galleries showcased trophies from Africa and Asia. The empire became woven into French identity itself, symbolizing national strength, technological prowess, and cultural grandeur. Yet beneath this glittering facade lay deep tensions. Questions about race, equality, and freedom that would eventually come to the surface in the violent struggles of decolonization. In these years, the French imperial project reached its apex, stretching across continents and involving millions of colonial subjects. It was a project justified in the language of civilization and progress, but in practice it brought domination, exploitation, and profound upheaval to the societies France claimed to uplift. As Paris basked in the illusion of imperial grandeur, the seeds of resistance were already taking root in the far-flung corners of its empire, waiting for the moment when the colonial center would no longer hold. Culture, mission, and the civilizing ideology. The expansion of the French Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries was not justified solely through dreams of wealth and power. It was equally couched in a sweeping moral narrative that came to be known as the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. French statesmen, intellectuals, and colonial officials insisted that their empire was not simply a project of conquest and exploitation, but a noble effort to bring progress, reason, and modernity to the less developed peoples of the world. This ideology was rooted in Enlightenment ideals, which championed the universality of reason and human rights, but it was twisted into a paternalistic justification for domination. French colonial leaders argued that, unlike other European powers, France ruled with a sense of moral duty to uplift indigenous populations, to spread education and scientific thinking, and to guide colonized societies toward the values of French republicanism. In speeches, books, and government proclamations, the French presented themselves as benevolent tutors, teaching the world to think and behave like France. Central to this ideological framework was the spread of the French language, seen not merely as a tool of communication but as a carrier of civilization itself. French was declared the language of administration, justice, and higher education across the empire. In North and West Africa, Indochina, and the Caribbean, French officials set up schools where native children learned French history, literature, and ideals. Colonial curricula often focused on memorizing the glories of France, its great leaders, its republican revolutions, its scientific triumphs, while denigrating local languages, customs, and traditions as backward or primitive. In these classrooms, the message was clear: to become modern, to gain opportunities, to be recognized as worthy by the colonial administration, one had to speak French, think French, and in some cases even attempt to become French in manner and dress. This policy of assimilation was particularly strong in the West African colonies, where a small elite of évolués, literally evolved ones, were granted limited rights and privileges in exchange for cultural and linguistic conformity. But the civilizing mission went beyond language. French administrators touted their legal codes as universal, rational systems that would replace what they viewed as the arbitrary or barbaric laws of colonized societies. Courts were established to handle disputes, often applying French civil or penal codes with little regard for local traditions. In theory, this was part of France's gift of modernity. In practice, it stripped away communal methods of conflict resolution and subordinated local leaders to distant colonial authorities. Education and law were linked to broader efforts to spread what colonial thinkers described as hygiene, rational planning, and social order. French doctors opened hospitals, often introducing Western medicine into regions where traditional healing practices had deep roots. Engineers built railways and ports, heralding them as symbols of progress. In coastal cities and inland garrisons, colonial officials supervised urban planning projects, redesigning streets and neighborhoods along European models while displacing native populations and disrupting older patterns of life. All of these efforts were presented to the French public as proof of France's moral superiority. The empire as an engine of light driving away the shadows of ignorance and superstition. Yet beneath this lofty rhetoric lay a harsher truth. The mission civilisatrice was also a powerful tool for consolidating political control, extracting resources, and reshaping colonized societies in ways that served France's economic and strategic interests. Furthermore, this ideology was profoundly hierarchical and racist at its core. Despite the language of universalism, colonial policy maintained stark divides between French citizens and colonial subjects. Rights and privileges were rarely extended equally, and the very idea of civilizing others carried the assumption of European superiority. Even those indigenous elites who learned French and adopted European customs often found that the promise of equality was hollow, their upward mobility constrained by deep prejudice and rigid colonial hierarchies. Yet, the spread of French language, law, and education also had unintended consequences. In classrooms and courtrooms across the empire, a new generation of colonial subjects learned the vocabulary of republicanism, equality, and national identity. Over time, these ideas, originally introduced as part of France's supposed gift, became weapons in the hands of anti-colonial activists who demanded that France live up to its professed ideals. They would turn the mission civilisatrice on its head, arguing that true civilization lay not in submission to empire, but in freedom and self-determination. Thus, the French imperial ideology of the civilizing mission was both a justification for conquest and a seedbed of resistance, a paradox at the heart of France's empire that would shape the battles and debates of the 20th century. Even as French officials trumpeted their mission to bring civilization and progress to their colonies, the people living under imperial rule often saw a very different reality. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, colonial subjects resisted the imposition of French authority, fought against exploitative systems, and challenged the legitimacy of foreign domination. This resistance took many forms: organized rebellions, small-scale uprisings, tax revolts, religious movements, and day-to-day acts of defiance that defied colonial administrators' efforts to create docile, compliant populations. In West Africa, one of the most famous figures of resistance was Samurai Touré, who led a powerful empire across parts of modern-day Guinea, Mali, and Ivory Coast in the late 19th century. Samurai's forces waged a protracted guerrilla war against French expansion, using their knowledge of terrain and deep networks of local support to hold off French armies for nearly 2 decades. Even as the French celebrated their eventual victory, in Paris the cost in lives and resources was enormous, a testament to the strength of African resistance. Similarly, in North Africa, Algerian communities never ceased to push back against French rule, even after the initial conquest. The brutal suppression of Abd al-Qadir's forces in the mid-19th century did not end resistance. Instead, smaller revolts continued to flare up, often in response to land seizures, heavy taxation, and cultural oppression. These revolts forced the French to commit tens of thousands of troops to Algeria, transforming it into one of the most militarized colonies in the empire. In Indochina, too, resistance simmered beneath the surface. From the outset of French expansion, in the 1850s, Vietnamese emperors and local officials staged defensive wars to hold back colonial forces. As the French consolidated power, a series of secret societies, peasant rebellions, and religiously inspired movements challenged colonial rule. Often dismissed by French officials as mere banditry, these insurgencies reflected deep popular anger at foreign domination, rising taxes, and the dismantling of local customs and governance. Colonial revolts were rarely confined to grand battles. They often took the form of subtle economic and social resistance. In French West Africa, farmers hid harvests to avoid forced requisition or taxation. In Algeria, rural communities clung fiercely to traditional land tenure systems, resisting attempts to parcel out communal lands to European settlers. In Indochina, workers on plantations and in factories staged strikes and slowdowns, defying French managers who sought to increase profits by pushing labor harder and cutting wages. The underlying cause of so much of this resistance was the economic exploitation built into the colonial system. From Senegal to Vietnam, French administrators organized colonial economies around the extraction of raw materials and the production of export crops that benefited France far more than local populations. Colonies were turned into sources of rubber, palm oil, peanuts, rice, coffee, cocoa, and minerals. French companies and investors reaped the profits, while colonial subjects labored under harsh conditions, often with little pay or legal protection. Taxation was another key tool of extraction. French colonial authorities imposed head taxes, hut taxes, and crop levies to finance their bureaucracies and military forces. In practice, these taxes forced African and Asian peasants into the money economy, pushing them to grow export crops or seek wage labor under exploitative conditions. In many places, those who could not pay were subject to fines, imprisonment, or forced labor. Infrastructure projects, the railways, roads, and ports often cited as symbols of progress, were built not primarily for the benefit of local people, but to facilitate the movement of troops and the export of goods to Europe. In West Africa, rail lines linked peanut-growing regions to Atlantic ports. In Indochina, river dredging projects and new roads opened up rice-growing deltas to French merchants. Meanwhile, colonial officials claimed credit for modernizing colonies, even as they siphoned off resources and wealth to fuel the French economy. This system of extraction rested on violence and coercion. French colonial forces cracked down on strikes, imprisoned or executed resistance leaders, and carried out punitive expeditions against villages accused of harboring rebels. Forced labor policies, particularly infamous in parts of equatorial Africa and Madagascar, conscripted tens of thousands of men into road and rail construction, often under brutal and deadly conditions. Yet despite this repression, resistance never disappeared. Every act of colonial exploitation bred new grievances, sparked fresh acts of defiance, and strengthened anti-colonial consciousness. French administrators often dismissed these uprisings as temporary disturbances, believing their empire unassailable. But beneath the surface, a tide was rising, one that would eventually sweep away the French imperial project, fueled by generations of resistance, sacrifice, and the unquenchable desire for freedom. Wars, resistance, and colonial cracks. The first half of the 20th century was marked by upheaval across the globe, and France's colonial empire was no exception. During both world wars, France relied heavily on its colonies for resources, manpower, and political support. In World War I alone, more than 500,000 colonial troops were mobilized from across Africa and Indochina to fight on European battlefields. These soldiers, often referred to as the tirailleurs sénégalais in West Africa and by other local designations elsewhere, fought bravely in the trenches of the Western Front, enduring brutal conditions and high casualty rates. French propaganda lauded their courage and sacrifice, hailing them as defenders of the Republic and promising recognition and respect. Yet in practice, these soldiers faced discrimination, lower pay, and limited rights compared to their French counterparts. After the war, many returned home to find little had changed. Promises of reform and equality faded quickly, replaced once more by the heavy hand of colonial administration and economic exploitation. World War II saw this pattern repeat, but with new complexities. As France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, the empire was split between the Vichy regime and Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle. Colonial subjects were again called upon to fight and die in a war that, for many, was still fundamentally European. In North Africa, the battles of El Alamein and Tunisia became pivotal moments in the Allied campaign, while West African ports and bases served as crucial staging grounds for the liberation of Europe. Throughout both wars, the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while living under colonial domination at home grew increasingly stark. Returning veterans demanded change, inspired by global currents of anti-fascism, nationalism, and self-determination. Across the empire, political movements, unions, and resistance groups began to coalesce, planting the seeds of decolonization. Nowhere was this more dramatically illustrated than in Algeria. Long considered an integral part of France rather than merely a colony, Algeria was home to more than 1 million European settlers, alongside 9 million indigenous Muslims. While France celebrated Algeria as part of its national territory, Algerian Muslims remained second-class citizens, subject to discriminatory laws and denied meaningful political representation. After World War II, Algerian demands for reform and greater autonomy were met with repression. Tensions boiled over in May 1945, when nationalist demonstrations in the towns of Sétif and Guelma were met with brutal force by French authorities. Thousands of Algerians were killed in reprisals, and the hopes of peaceful reform dimmed. In 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched a coordinated insurgency against French rule, marking the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence. Over the next 8 years, Algeria descended into a bloody conflict that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. French forces responded with overwhelming force, deploying nearly 500,000 troops, conducting mass arrests, and engaging in systematic torture and reprisals against civilians. The war polarized French society and politics, sparking fierce debates in Paris over the morality of torture, the viability of continued colonial rule, and the future of the French Republic itself. As the conflict dragged on, the FLN expanded its support among rural and urban populations, building a network of fighters, informants, and political cadres committed to independence at any cost. The brutality of the conflict shocked the world. Images and reports of French repression drew condemnation, while the FLN's own use of terror tactics in urban centers like Algiers added further layers of tragedy and complexity. Ultimately, France could not sustain the war. Faced with mounting casualties, political divisions at home, and international pressure, President Charles de Gaulle initiated negotiations with the FLN. The Evian Accords, signed in 1962, brought an official end to the war and paved the way for Algerian independence. Over 1 million Europeans fled Algeria in the aftermath, and France was left grappling with the trauma of a war that had nearly torn its own society apart. The Algerian War left deep scars, both in France and Algeria. It shattered the illusion of the French Empire as a benevolent force and exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that spoke of liberty and fraternity while ruling millions without consent. The conflict also signaled a broader collapse of the old imperial order, setting the stage for further struggles and the eventual dismantling of France's empire in Africa and Asia. In the years following World War II, the Vietnamese struggle for independence became one of the clearest symbols of a global tide turning against colonial rule. The roots of this conflict stretched back decades, as France consolidated its hold over Indochina in the late 19th century and imposed systems of taxation, land seizures, and cultural domination. Under French rule, Vietnamese farmers lost ancestral lands to large plantations, taxes grew heavier, and nationalist organizations faced constant repression. Yet despite censorship and violence, a powerful anti-colonial movement slowly emerged, led by figures who blended nationalism with revolutionary ideology. Among them was Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary who spent years abroad, studying in France, the Soviet Union, and China. Ho returned to Vietnam with a vision of national liberation grounded in Marxist-Leninist thought. In 1941, he founded the Viet Minh, a broad-based nationalist front committed to independence from France and resistance against Japanese occupation during World War II. The Viet Minh built networks in rural villages, trained guerrilla fighters, and gradually expanded its influence across northern Vietnam. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Viet Minh seized the moment. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, citing America's own Declaration of Independence as inspiration. But France, eager to reclaim its empire after the humiliation of Nazi occupation, refused to recognize Vietnamese sovereignty. Tensions escalated as French forces re-entered the region, seeking to restore colonial rule in the south, while negotiating tenuously with Ho's government in the north. The fragile peace collapsed completely in late 1946, when clashes broke out in Haiphong and Hanoi between French troops and Viet Minh forces. This marked the beginning of the First Indochina War, a bloody conflict that would last nearly 8 years. Unlike earlier uprisings, the First Indochina War was a full-scale war for national liberation, with the Viet Minh building extensive networks of supply lines, hidden bases, and popular support across the countryside. The French, for their part, relied on elite colonial units, foreign legionnaires, and air power, establishing fortified positions in key cities and towns. Yet they struggled to defeat an enemy that could melt away into jungles and mountains, returning to strike with ambushes and sabotage. The conflict quickly revealed the limits of French colonial power. Despite controlling major cities, the French could not win over the rural population, who often viewed them as outsiders and oppressors. The Viet Minh, in contrast, used land reforms and propaganda to rally peasants, promising a new, independent Vietnam where landlords would be toppled and foreign rulers expelled. The war also took on broader geopolitical significance. As the Cold War intensified, the United States began to back the French effort with military aid and funding, fearing that a Viet Minh victory would spread communism in Asia. Meanwhile, the newly formed People's Republic of China provided weapons, training, and sanctuary to the Viet Minh, creating an international proxy conflict in Southeast Asia. By the early 1950s, the cost of the war, both in money and lives, began to weigh heavily on France. A pivotal moment came in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, where French forces built a massive fortified camp in a remote valley, hoping to draw the Viet Minh into a decisive battle. Instead, the Viet Minh encircled the camp, hauling artillery into surrounding hills and subjecting the garrison to a brutal siege. After weeks of intense fighting, the French position collapsed, and thousands of soldiers were captured. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu shocked France and the world. It forced French leaders to the negotiating table at Geneva, where they agreed to withdraw from northern Vietnam, temporarily dividing the country along the 17th parallel and paving the way for eventual national elections that, under US pressure, would never come to pass, leading instead to further conflict. This Vietnamese victory was more than a local triumph. Around the world, it became a rallying cry for other anti-colonial movements, showing that a determined insurgency could defeat even a modern European army. From Algeria to Ghana, from Kenya to Indonesia, nationalist leaders pointed to Vietnam as proof that empires were no longer invincible. The rise of anti-colonial sentiment in this period was not confined to Asia. Across Africa and the Middle East, veterans of World War II returned home with new expectations of freedom and equality. The global movement for decolonization gathered momentum, as colonial subjects demanded the rights and sovereignty that Europeans had long denied them. French leaders, once confident in their empire's permanence, now faced a stark reality. The world was changing, and the era of empires was ending. The struggle in Vietnam was a harbinger of things to come, signaling that the old structures of domination would not survive the rising tide of global self-determination. Decolonization and the end of empire. The middle of the 20th century marked a turning point not only for France but for the entire world. The global tide of decolonization surged with unstoppable force, and France, long a symbol of imperial power and prestige, was forced to grapple with the collapse of its colonial empire. Two conflicts in particular, the war in Indochina and the struggle for Algerian independence, illustrated the painful, violent, and deeply transformative process by which the French Empire unraveled. In Indochina, the war that began in 1946 with the Viet Minh's struggle against French reoccupation reached its dramatic climax in 1954. For nearly 8 years, French forces attempted to crush the Viet Minh insurgency, pouring resources, troops, and American-backed military aid into the conflict. Yet despite their superior firepower and control of major cities, French forces found themselves trapped in a war without end. The final chapter came at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northern Vietnam, where French commanders hoped to lure the Viet Minh into a pitched battle that would break their strength. Instead, the opposite occurred. Viet Minh forces under the command of General Vo Nguyen Giap surrounded the French garrison and subjected it to weeks of relentless bombardment. The French, unable to break the siege or resupply effectively, were forced to surrender in May 1954. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu stunned the French public and sent shockwaves through Europe and the wider world. It was the first time a modern European power had been decisively defeated by a nationalist movement in a colonial war, and it spelled the end of France's dream of reclaiming Indochina. In July 1954, the Geneva Accords formally ended the conflict, recognizing the independence of Vietnam, temporarily divided into North and South, as well as Laos and Cambodia. Yet even as France withdrew from Southeast Asia, another, perhaps even more painful colonial war raged in Algeria. Long considered an integral part of France rather than merely a colony, Algeria had been under French rule since 1830. Over 1 million European settlers known as Pieds Noirs lived alongside millions of indigenous Muslims who were denied equal political rights and endured systemic discrimination. In November 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched a coordinated uprising against French rule, marking the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence. The FLN waged a brutal guerrilla campaign, attacking military targets, government installations, and settler communities. In response, French forces deployed massive numbers of troops, using torture, mass arrests, and counterinsurgency tactics to try to crush the rebellion. The war quickly became one of the bloodiest and most controversial conflicts of the decolonization era. Entire villages were uprooted, civilians caught between two warring sides, and the French military's use of torture sparked fierce debates in Paris and across the world. In 1958, the conflict triggered a political crisis in France itself, leading to the collapse of the Fourth Republic and the return of Charles de Gaulle to power. De Gaulle, initially vague about his intentions in Algeria, soon recognized that France could not win the war without sacrificing its democratic ideals and international standing. Over fierce objections from settler groups and French army officers, he opened negotiations with the FLN. In March 1962, the Evian Accords were signed, establishing a ceasefire and paving the way for a referendum on independence. In July 1962, Algerians voted overwhelmingly for independence, ending 132 years of colonial rule. More than 1 million European settlers fled the country in the months that followed, leaving behind businesses, homes, and lives built over generations. For France, the loss of Algeria was not just the end of an empire. It was a national trauma that would haunt French politics and society for decades. Together, the independence of Indochina and Algeria signaled the crumbling of the French Empire, long touted as a civilizing mission and source of national glory. In their place arose new nations, often born in violence and uncertainty, yet determined to chart their own paths free from European domination. In Paris, the mood was one of exhaustion and reflection. The era of empire had ended, replaced by a new age of diplomacy, post-colonial relationships, and debates over France's identity in a world where colonial power no longer defined national greatness. As the 1960s dawned, the world entered a period of dramatic transformation, especially across Africa. France, still reeling from the costly and painful conflicts in Indochina and Algeria, now faced a continent-wide wave of independence movements that would rapidly dismantle much of its remaining empire. Known as the Year of Africa, 1960, alone saw 17 African nations achieve independence, and for France, it was the culmination of years of negotiation, resistance, and shifting global currents that made colonial rule increasingly untenable. The roots of this decolonization wave stretch back decades. Throughout the early 20th century, African leaders, intellectuals, and veterans of both world wars began to organize, forming unions, nationalist parties, and grassroots movements that challenged colonial authority. In French West Africa, figures like Léopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal and Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Ivory Coast rose to prominence, combining demands for greater representation with calls for eventual sovereignty. World War II was a key turning point. Hundreds of thousands of Africans served in French armies, fighting and dying on European battlefields while being told they were defending freedom and democracy. Returning veterans, having witnessed Europe's own vulnerability and hypocrisy, brought new expectations back to Africa, the promise of political rights, economic opportunity, and respect. Yet colonial authorities were slow to deliver, fueling strikes, protests, and eventually coordinated independence movements. By the late 1950s, the winds of change had become impossible to ignore. Across French West and Equatorial Africa, new parties emerged to demand autonomy, while the broader international community, including the newly formed United Nations, began pressuring European powers to end colonial rule. France, exhausted from its wars in Asia and North Africa, found itself unable and increasingly unwilling to maintain its empire through force. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle offered the colonies a choice through a constitutional referendum: join a new French community with limited self-government or pursue immediate independence. While most African territories initially voted to remain within the community, by 1960, momentum had shifted decisively toward full sovereignty. In rapid succession, countries like Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Chad, Gabon, Congo, Brazzaville, and others declared independence, often with France's formal recognition. This wave of decolonization was not entirely smooth. Border disputes, ethnic tensions, and power struggles emerged almost immediately in many new states. Some leaders were quickly overthrown or assassinated, while others grappled with the challenge of building stable institutions out of colonial frameworks that had long been designed to serve French rather than local interests. Yet for France, this moment also offered opportunity. Unlike the bloody and bitter Algerian conflict, many African decolonization processes involved negotiation, cooperation, and carefully staged transitions. France worked to maintain economic and cultural ties with its former colonies, establishing defense agreements, aid packages, and special trade relationships that linked Paris to the capitals of newly independent African nations. This new phase of Franco-African relations became known as France-Afrique, a complex web of diplomatic, military, and business connections through which France sought to preserve influence without direct rule. French companies retained significant stakes in African mining, oil, and agriculture. French military advisors stayed on in many countries, and Paris presented itself as a partner and protector amid Cold War rivalries that threatened to pull Africa into the struggle between East and West. Critics, however, viewed France-Afrique as neo-colonialism by another name. They argued that France propped up authoritarian leaders, manipulated elections, and prioritized its economic interests over African self-determination. Scandals over corruption and secret arms deals would later haunt France's reputation on the continent, revealing the lingering shadows of empire even after formal independence. Nonetheless, the 1960s marked a watershed in the relationship between France and Africa. From the ashes of empire emerged a network of post-colonial ties that blended cultural connection, the French language, educational exchanges, diplomatic forums, with deep debates over sovereignty, equality, and memory. As African leaders took the reins of their countries, they balanced new national identities with old ties to Paris. They joined international organizations, reimagined economies, and forged new foreign alliances beyond the former colonial metropole. Yet in many African capitals, the imprint of France remained in schools, legal systems, currencies, and cultural life. For France, the end of empire forced a national reckoning. What did it mean to be a great power without colonies? How could a nation built on ideas of universalism and civilization reconcile itself with decades of exploitation and violence? These questions would continue to haunt French politics and culture, shaping debates over immigration, memory, and France's role in the world for generations to come. The African decolonization wave was not simply the end of French imperial rule. It was the beginning of a new, complicated and often fraught relationship between France and a continent whose fate had once seemed tied to its own glory. In the transition from colonial empire to post-colonial partnerships, the ghosts of history remained, but so too did the possibility of building something different, rooted in respect, dialogue, and mutual recognition. Legacy of the French Empire. Today, long after the flags of France have been lowered across its former colonies, the legacy of the French Empire continues to echo across continents and cultures. One of the most visible and enduring signs of this legacy is the vast Francophone world, a community of nations bound by the French language, shared histories, and ongoing economic and cultural ties. From the streets of Dakar to the marketplaces of Hanoi, from the schools of Abidjan to the radio stations of Montreal, French remains a living thread that connects disparate peoples and places, a reminder of both a common past and a continually evolving present. In Africa, French is spoken by millions across West and Central regions, where it often serves as an official or national language bridging diverse ethnic and linguistic groups. In countries like Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, French has become not merely a colonial remnant, but a practical tool for administration, education, and regional diplomacy. In North Africa, French remains deeply embedded in higher education, media, and business, particularly in countries like Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, despite these nations' complex and sometimes ambivalent relationships with their former colonizer. Beyond Africa, the French language and cultural imprint persist in the Caribbean, in Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, and in the Pacific territories of New Caledonia and French Polynesia. Even in Southeast Asia, where French rule ended decades ago, traces remain in architecture, cuisine, and urban planning, particularly in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Trade ties, too, continue to connect France with its former colonies. France remains a significant investor in African infrastructure, energy, telecommunications, and resource extraction. French companies operate railways, ports, and factories across the continent, while many African countries export agricultural and mineral products to European markets. At the same time, African diaspora communities in France have built vibrant networks of commerce, culture, and political influence, shaping French society itself in profound ways. Yet this legacy is also fraught with controversy and debate. In recent years, activists, scholars, and ordinary citizens have called for a reckoning with the darker chapters of France's imperial past. Across the Francophone world, statues of colonial figures and monuments to imperial conquest have become flashpoints for protest, seen by many as symbols of oppression, racism, and exploitation. In France itself, cities like Bordeaux and Nantes, once enriched by the Atlantic slave trade, have faced calls to acknowledge and memorialize their roles in centuries of human trafficking. Discussions of reparations have gained momentum, particularly in relation to slavery and colonial violence. In the Caribbean, activists in Guadeloupe and Martinique have demanded formal apologies and reparative justice for centuries of forced labor, while in Africa, scholars and political leaders have raised questions about the restitution of cultural artifacts and the return of resources extracted under colonial rule. At the heart of these debates lies a larger question about memory. How should nations remember and teach their imperial histories? In France, school curricula, museums, and public discourse have often celebrated the glories of exploration, scientific advance, and the so-called civilizing mission, while downplaying or ignoring the brutality, coercion, and exploitation that underpinned empire. But as new generations of historians and citizens press for more honest reckoning, the narrative has begun to shift. Documentaries, academic works, and public exhibitions now increasingly foreground the voices of colonized peoples and the costs of empire, challenging old myths of grandeur with painful truths. These debates also intersect with modern issues of immigration, race, and national identity in France. As the descendants of colonized peoples make up a growing part of the French population, questions arise about belonging, citizenship, and equality. Some argue that confronting the past is essential to building a more inclusive society. Others resist, fearing that revisiting the empire's crimes undermines national pride. Meanwhile, the Francophone world continues to evolve as countries, once bound to Paris, forge new paths, alliances, and identities. African nations increasingly assert themselves on the world stage, diversifying their economies and partnerships beyond France. Yet cultural connections endure. Literary festivals, sporting events, music, and art still flow along Francophone channels, offering spaces for dialogue and shared creativity.